All right, let's get right into it. Today we're diving deep into the case of Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento. I've got some excerpts here from his Wikipedia page. And yeah, I think it's safe to say this is not your typical true crime story.
No, not at all. The nickname Vampire Sacramento, it's not just some catchy label, you know.
Mhm.
It really gets at the truly horrific nature of his crimes.
Yeah, and this is all happening in the late 1970s, right? Like a time when serial killers were becoming, this terrifying part of the public consciousness.
Exactly. And Chase's case, I mean, it really stands out because of the psychological complexities involved. We're going beyond just the basic who, what, where with this one.
Right, we want to try and get into the WHY as much as the what.
Exactly. And one of the things that I think makes this case so fascinating is the presence of what's known as the McDonald triad in Chase's early life.
Okay, so for our listeners out there, can you break down what the McDonald triad is? I have to admit, I had to do a little refresher myself.
Sure. So the McDonald triad, it's this set of three behaviors that show up in childhood and have been linked to later violent tendencies.
Okay, and what are those three behaviors?
So we're talking about animal cruelty, setting fires, and then also bedwetting that persists past a certain age.
Interesting. And so with Chase, we see all three of these present before he even turns 5.
Yeah. Before the age of 5.
Yeah.
Which, makes you wonder about those roots of violence, right? Could this have been a sign of things to come?
Yeah, and it's even more striking because by all accounts, his childhood seemed pretty normal.
Right. One detail that really stood out to me was that one of his birthday parties had over 60 people there. I mean, that paints a picture of a pretty well-adjusted kid, right?
Yeah, so it's like this really stark contrast.
It is almost a Jekyll and Hyde situation, right?
Right. So, okay, we have this seemingly normal childhood, but then you have these very disturbing undercurrents already kind of bubbling up to the surface.
Yeah, and the McDonald triad, it's really key to understanding the trajectory of his life.
Right.
These early behaviors, they weren't just isolated incidents,
Right, they formed a pattern.
a pattern that, in retrospect, is, well, it's deeply concerning.
Absolutely. And as he gets into his teenage years, things seem to escalate. We see drug use, struggles with impotence, even this weird fixation on what he called the cowboy gang. It's like he's slowly losing his grip on reality.
You're right on the money there.
Yes.
Each of these, especially the impotence, probably had a big impact on his self-image and his ability to connect with others, in a healthy way.
Right.
And it's almost like the snowball effect, right? Where each
Yeah.
negative experience kind of pushes him further down this path.
Yeah, it builds on itself. And then there's the hypochondria. I mean, some of his delusions were so bizarre, like believing that his heart had stopped or that someone had stolen one of his arteries, or even wearing oranges on his head to try to absorb vitamin C.
Yeah, it's strange for sure. But it's also this really important window into his mental state. Like his brain is misinterpreting basic bodily functions.
So it's not that he's choosing to be irrational.
No, he's not. It's that his reality is becoming more and more distorted.
So in a way, he was kind of a prisoner of his own mind.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And what makes it even more tragic is that he did try to get help. He sought medical attention several times. But he was often met with frustration and dismissal.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if he had gotten more comprehensive psychiatric care early on, could things have been different?
It's a question that haunts a lot of these cases, right? The what if?
Absolutely. But there's one incident that really sent chills down my spine. Reading about how he killed a cat after seeing a news report about a cat getting extensive medical treatment.
Right. That's incredibly telling. It suggests this growing resentment and paranoia. Like he's thinking, why is this animal getting care that I'm not?
Right. It really highlights how distorted his worldview was becoming.
It does. And all of this culminates in his first involuntary commitment to a mental institution in 1973.
Yeah. What happened there?
Well, the doctor's report is pretty stark. He described Chase as filthy, disheveled, deteriorated, and foul-smelling. The doctor diagnosed him with acute paranoid schizophrenia, which offers some explanation for his behavior and delusions.
Yeah, that must have been a real turning point for everyone involved, realizing how serious his condition was.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is that there was also some discussion at the time about the schizophrenogenic mother theory,
Uh-huh.
which thankfully has been debunked since then.
Can you explain that a little?
Sure. So basically, this theory blamed the mothers of people with schizophrenia for their condition. Obviously, we know that's not true, but it was a prevailing thought in psychology at the time.
Wow. And it is interesting, though, that even the doctor expressed some concerns about Chase's mother. He noted her aggressive behavior and actually referred to her as a schizophrenic mother.
Yeah, so it makes you wonder about those family dynamics and potential environmental factors, right?
It does. It adds another layer of complexity to this case, for sure.
For sure. But here's where things take a turn. While Chase was on medication, his mental state actually improved.
Okay, so there's a glimmer of hope there.
There is. It shows that treatment could have potentially made a difference, but then his mother took him off the medication because she didn't like the side effects.
Oh, wow. You have to wonder if she really understood the gravity of the situation.
It's a tragic illustration of the challenges around treating mental illness,
Yeah.
especially back then. Taking someone off medication, especially someone as unstable as Chase, could have devastating consequences.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we're going to see those consequences play out as we continue to delve deeper into this case.
We are. Stay tuned. And taking him off the medication, it really does prove to be this turning point. Like you're taking the guardrails off when he's already speeding down this dangerous road.
And we see this reflected in his actions, in what he does.
Absolutely. He starts out killing and eating rabbits and birds, but then it progresses to dogs. And his methods, they get more and more brutal. He's hanging them, cutting them open, drinking their blood.
It's just terrifying to think that all this is happening kind of under the radar, right? He's living in his own apartment. His father's even playing chess with him regularly. It's like this whole other reality going on.
Yeah, and it's this chilling reminder that mental illness, it often hides in plain sight. Even those closest to Chase, they couldn't fully grasp what was going on inside his head.
And this brings us to his second involuntary commitment in 1976. What leads to this one?
He's found in his apartment suffering from blood poisoning.
Blood poisoning? What from?
He had been injecting rabbit blood into his veins.
Oh my God. It's like something out of a Gothic novel. And this time, they keep him in the hospital, right?
Well, you would think so, wouldn't you? But despite everything, his clear mental instability, his actions he's deemed no longer a danger to society and released back into his mother's care.
You're kidding. I mean, even after the rabbit blood incident.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. And get this, some of the staff at the mental institution even disagreed with the decision.
It just seems like such a failure of the system, How could they not see the danger he posed?
It really shows the limitations of psychiatric evaluation back then, I think. And to make matters worse, you guessed it, his mother takes him off his medication again.
Oh no, it's like a repeat of the same tragic mistake.
It is. And this time, the stakes are even higher.
Because now he's about to embark on his killing spree.
Exactly. He's on this collision course,
Yeah.
His descent into darkness, it's accelerating. And soon his victims, they're not going to be animals anymore.
This brings us to December 1977, the start of Chase's terrifying killing spree. And his first victim, Ambrose Griffin, is killed in a seemingly random drive-by shooting.
Right. It's a major turning point, Griffin was just unloading groceries from his car when Chase just, out of nowhere, shoots him dead.
Wow. It must have been absolutely devastating for Griffin's family, right? I mean, to lose someone so suddenly, so senselessly.
Absolutely. And this first murder, it really sets the stage for what's to come. Chase's crimes, they seem chaotic, driven by impulse.
So not necessarily any clear motive.
Right. And from there, we see him attempting to enter other homes. And this is where his locked door philosophy comes into play.
His locked door philosophy. What's that?
So this is where we see his distorted thinking even more clearly. He believed that locked doors meant he wasn't welcome. But if a door was unlocked, that meant he was invited in.
Okay. I mean, it's obviously delusional, but is there like a twisted logic to it? Like he's trying to impose rules on a world that he feels is out of control.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not just random irrational behavior. There's this attempt to create order within his delusions,
Right.
In his mind, he's not breaking in, he's following the rules.
It's just so chilling, but also really sad. And then, just a month after the Griffin murder, he commits his first truly horrific crime, the murder of Teresa Wallin.
Yeah, this is where the brutality really takes this horrifying turn. He breaks into her home, shoots her multiple times, and then engages in acts of necrophilia and mutilation.
And to make matters even worse, Wallin was 3 months pregnant at the time.
You're right. The crime scene was so horrific, it really shook even the most seasoned police officers to their core. I mean, he removed organs, drank her blood, stuffed dog feces down her throat.
It's like he's trying to dehumanize his victims completely.
Exactly. And what's even more disturbing is the possibility that Wallin was actually still alive during some of the mutilation.
God, it's too awful to even think about.
Yeah.
And then just days later, Chase commits his most infamous crime, The Miroth family massacre.
This is the one that really cemented his place in true crime history. It was a chaotic, frenzied attack that left 4 people dead.
4? Oh my God, who were they?
38-year-old Evelyn Miroth, her 6-year-old son Jason, her friend Dan Meredith, and then her 22-month-old nephew, David Ferreira.
It seems like he just unleashed all of his rage and violence in this one horrific act.
The crime scene, it was described as a house of carnage. Blood everywhere. It was just awful. He shot and stabbed his victim. I mean, this level of intensity, that's hard to even comprehend.
And in the midst of all this, he abducts baby David Ferreira.
Yeah, taking this helpless infant, I mean, it gripped the entire community with fear. People were terrified.
The police must have been under immense pressure to catch him before he could strike again.
Absolutely. And thankfully, they had some pretty crucial evidence to go on. The brutality, the blood evidence, the missing baby, it all pointed to a connection with the Wallen murder. They knew they were dealing with a serial killer.
And they brought in the FBI to help.
Exactly. They brought in Robert Ressler, who was a pioneer in the field of criminal profiling.
So they were using behavioral clues to try and build a profile of the killer.
Right. They determined that they were looking for a white male in his 20s, probably suffering from some kind of severe mental illness.
And this profile, it helped them to zero in on Chase.
It did. But they needed more. They needed a break in the case.
And that break came from an unlikely source. Right. An old acquaintance of Chase's.
Exactly. A woman named Nancy Westfall came forward and told police about this really chilling encounter she had with Chase not long before the Wallen murder.
What happened?
She said he was covered in bloodstains, had this weird yellow crust around his mouth, and his eyes looked totally sunken. He even asked her about an ex-boyfriend of hers who had died in a motorcycle accident years earlier.
God, that's so creepy. It must have been terrifying for her.
It was. But her testimony, along with the FBI profile and descriptions from neighbors, it all helped the police to finally zero in on their suspect. They were closing in on the Vampire of Sacramento.
It sounds like they had all these pieces of the puzzle, you know, and they were finally starting to put it all together.
Yeah, but they still needed to find him, right? They had to apprehend him before he could hurt anyone else.
Right. It was a race against time.
Exactly. And thankfully, they were able to track him down to his apartment.
And what did they find when they got there?
It was horrifying. It was like stepping into a nightmare, you know? The walls, the floor, the ceiling, even the refrigerator and his dishes, everything was covered in blood.
God, I can't even imagine what that must have been like for the investigators to see that.
It's a constant reminder of the dark side of humanity, you know? But amidst the horror, there were clues, dog collars, rotting animal organs, and evidence that he had been eating parts of his victims.
So it confirmed his cannibalism.
Yes, it was chilling.
So they find all this gruesome evidence, but where was Chase?
He wasn't in the apartment at first, but after a short pursuit, they were able to apprehend him.
He didn't go quietly, I imagine.
No, he resisted arrest. It was like he was clinging to that last shred of freedom, even though it was clear his reign of terror was over.
So the Vampire of Sacramento was finally caught. What happened during his interrogation?
He was surprisingly candid, actually. He confessed to killing just a few people. But there was this chilling lack of remorse. You know, it was like the gravity of his actions hadn't really sunk in.
It's like he was completely detached from reality, almost.
Exactly. And his explanations for his crimes were rooted in his delusions. He talked about needing blood, claimed that his own blood was turning to powder because of something he called soap dish poisoning.
It's just another reminder that we're dealing with someone whose perception of reality was completely warped.
Absolutely. And these delusions weren't a choice for him, you know. They were a symptom of his severe mental illness.
So the case goes to trial. What was the defense strategy?
The defense argued that he wasn't guilty by reason of insanity, citing his long history of mental illness. It was a complex argument, though, because while his actions were clearly driven by his delusions, there was also evidence of premeditation.
It sounds like a real legal and ethical dilemma, you know? Like, how do you determine culpability when mental illness is involved?
It's one of the toughest questions in criminal justice, for sure. And in Chase's case, the jury ultimately rejected the insanity plea. He was found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder.
Wow. So what was his sentence?
He was sentenced to death in the gas chamber.
It seems like the justice system was sending a pretty clear message with that sentence.
Yeah, but it also raises questions, right, about the effectiveness of the death penalty, especially when you're dealing with someone who had such severe mental illness.
Yeah.
Is retribution really justice in these cases? It's hard to say.
It's a debate that continues to this day. So Chase is on death row now. What happens next?
Well, while he was awaiting execution at San Quentin, he continued to exhibit bizarre behavior, claimed to be a victim of Nazi UFOs, talked about his blood turning to powder. His delusions persisted even in the face of, his impending doom.
It's just tragic, It really shows the power of mental
It
illness.
does. And then, before his execution date arrived, Chase was found dead in his cell.
Mm.
He had overdosed on antidepressants that he had been hoarding.
Oh, wow. So was it suicide?
The exact circumstances surrounding his death are still a mystery. Some people believe it was a deliberate suicide, while others think it was accidental. Maybe an attempt to silence the voices in his head.
It's a haunting end to a really disturbing story.
It is. The story of Richard Chase, it's a tragedy on multiple levels, really. It reminds us of the devastating impact of untreated mental illness, the failings of the system to adequately address these issues, and, it also speaks to the fascination we have with serial killers, with the darkness they represent.
It definitely makes you think about the human condition, And what are some of the key takeaways you think our listeners should walk away with? What have we learned from this deep dive?
Well, I think first and foremost, it highlights how important mental health awareness is and access to proper treatment. Chase's case is a tragic example of what can happen when mental illness goes untreated.
It also raises questions about society's responsibility to care for its most vulnerable members, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There were so many points in Chase's life where intervention could have potentially made a difference. His family, the doctors who treated him, the legal system, they all played a role in this tragedy.
And it underscores the complexity of the legal system, right? Especially when dealing with cases of mental illness.
Yeah. The insanity defense, it's very rarely successful. And the line between culpability and diminished capacity, it's often blurry.
So where do we go from here? What can we learn from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to remember that this isn't just a story about a monster. This is a story about a human being who was deeply troubled and failed by the very systems that should have helped him.
It's a story that should make us think about mental health, about compassion, about our responsibility to each other as a society.
And it's also a reminder that evil, it's not always something people are born with. It can be cultivated, through neglect, through trauma, through a system that doesn't see the signs of distress.
This deep dive has given us a lot to think about. And while we've reached the end of our exploration of Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento, I think the questions and the lessons will stay with us.
This is just a starting point. It's
Yeah.
meant to make you curious and encourage you to learn more about this case, about mental illness, about the complexities of the criminal justice system.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in exploring this further, I highly recommend Robert Ressler's book, Whoever Fights Monsters. It's a really fascinating look into the minds of serial killers and the world of criminal profiling.
And if you want to learn more about the psychology behind all of this, I would suggest looking into the McDonald Triad. It can really help us understand violent behavior.
We hope you feel informed, but also motivated to keep exploring these complex issues.
The journey to understanding the dark side of human nature, it's a long one. But it's a journey worth taking, if it means we can prevent future tragedies.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the chilling world of Richard Chase. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.